Our scripture reading this morning comes from Matthew 10, 1 through 15. And he called to them his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out and to heal every disease and every affliction. The names of the 12 apostles are these: first, Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, James the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. These 12 Jesus sent out, instructing them, "Go nowhere among the Gentiles, and enter no town of the Samaritans, but go rather to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And proclaim as you go, saying, the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Heal the sick, raise the dead, cleanse lepers, cast out demons. You received without paying, give without pay. Acquire no gold or silver or copper for your belts, no bag for your journey, or 2 tunics or sandals or a staff, for the laborer deserves his food. And whatever town or village you enter, find out who is worthy in it, and stay there until you depart. As you enter the house, greet it. And if the house is worthy, let your peace come upon it. But if it is not worthy, let your peace return to you. And if anyone will not receive you or listen to your words, shake off the dust from your feet when you leave that house or town. Truly, I say to you, it will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town." This is the word of our Lord.
I don't know how handy you are with tools. Some of you probably are very handy. I am not. But I have a lot of friends who are, and I have a lot of friends who are brave enough to do crazy things like remodel their homes. But even if you are not handy with tools and don't know people who are, I think that everyone here knows the expression, "take it down to the studs." We do know that expression, don't we? There's a kind of remodeling that is just taking some cabinets out, putting new cabinets in. But there's a whole different kind of remodeling done by people for whom that is not a frightening expression. Take it down to the studs. I've been in a home where someone was doing that, and it's terrifying. Living in a house where a portion of that house, there are no walls, just studs. All the wires are visible. The junction boxes are visible. It is a terrifying, terrifying thing. It means it's time to sell that house and move on. No one should live there. Take it down to the studs. We're looking at a passage in Matthew's Gospel, Matthew chapter 10, which if you have a red letter edition of the Bible, it gets very red right here. There's some that say that the structure of Matthew's Gospel is according to 5 discourses of Jesus, 5 more or less sermons of Jesus, so Matthew 5 through 7. That seems to be an extended sermon. And Matthew chapter 10 is another one of those. And what I've done is, we're still, of course, making our way through Matthew's Gospel, but this is a subsection. What is Matthew chapter 10 about? It seems to me that Matthew chapter 10 is about what it's like, nuts and bolts, following Jesus. It's the basics. What is it like following this Jesus? And in the first part of our passage, I want you to especially see this. Jesus is taking mission, the task of following Jesus in your day-to-day life. He is taking that and he is ripping it down to the studs. So you can see what exactly is involved in living a life in which you are serving Jesus. When you take something down to the studs, you actually see the limitations that you're working with. You see the walls and the pillars, I don't know what else to call them, the larger pieces of wood. You see the things that can't be moved. There's limitations there. You also see what needs to be done. These things need to be focused on. If you take it down to the studs, there's a sense in which it's very honest what you can do and what you cannot do. If you were to look at Matthew's gospel, you might notice that this is the first, maybe the second time that Jesus articulates an actual task, something that should be done. Another contender for this, the tasks of Jesus for his disciples. If you go up just a little bit to the end of Matthew chapter 9, that's a contender for the first task that Jesus gives to his disciples, where he calls out specifically at the closing of chapter 9 to pray. And here he is calling out specifically a different task, and that is to proclaim. See, so closing chapter 9 with prayer. But here we have a clear task. Proclaim. He's sending them out. But not until he first takes it down to the studs. Here's what this passage tells us. This passage tells us that the followers of Jesus proclaim the gospel at a cost to themselves. That's what this passage is about. The followers of Jesus, they proclaim the gospel at a cost to themselves. And I want to simply just look at those two things separately. So more or less 2 points to the sermon. That first phrase, proclaiming the gospel. I want to talk about that, and then we'll talk about the task. And we think about proclaiming the gospel. Really what Jesus is saying here is he's saying that proclaiming the gospel is an authority-enriched task. Proclaiming the gospel is an authority-enriched task. Again, keep in mind there's very few tasks thus far in Matthew's gospel. But as Jesus takes this task down to the studs, he shows us that authority, his authority, is critical to the task of proclaiming the gospel. You see what he says here. He says in verse 1 that Jesus gave them authority. That's the first thing we need to understand about this authority. Proclaiming the gospel is an authority-enriched task. Well, authority is derived from Jesus. He gave them authority. I want you to just think about this concept of authority for a moment. Sometimes we don't give very much thought to something that we just feel like we already understand. But if you think about authority, think about anyone that you know who has an authority that is purely derived by themselves. What kind of authority is that? That's not what Jesus is talking about here. He's talking about an authority that's derived from him. But if you think about those who have authority, the boss of a company, the CEO of a company, that he or she at some point is accountable to a board, or if it's a public company, to shareholders. It's a kind of derived authority. If it's a company that is owned and it's not publicly owned, the boss of that company still they have an authority that is derived at least in the sense that that company has to follow the laws of the nation. The authority that they have, well, it's not a freely authored authority. There's a kind of submission there. And we think about that about a president. A president has an authority that's derived from the people. If you think about parenthood, your authority over a parent, it can't possibly be derived simply from your own authority as a parent. You actually didn't manufacture that child, did you? There's an outside influence that gave birth to that child. There's something about that parental authority that, all things being equal, is somehow derived, whether you believe in Jesus or not. It might help to think about the kind of authority that might not be derived. The scary case of a dictator who rules haughtily and angrily. You might be able to argue that that kind of ruler is still serving with a derived authority because they need a military to keep the people in line so that the people don't rebel. There's this sense in which the dictator derives their authority or a portion of it from the military. What about a king? There's a sense in which a king has the kind of authority that is not derived, maybe derived by birth, by their ancestry. This is worth thinking about because Jesus is the only one who has an authority that is not self-derived. It's the kind of authority, that is self-derived. An authority that we'll see as we proclaim the gospel, that is an authority that is all about Jesus. But we can never say that the disciples have an authority in and of themselves because of verse 1. Jesus gave them authority. And if they've received authority, it can't be wielded however they see fit. If you look at verse 8, verse 8 kind of stands out to us. Verse 8 reads, "You received without paying, give without pay." And some commentators say that that expression, it's supposed to be folded into verse 9, which then is about the acquiring of a kind of wealth. But verse 8, I think, really is a statement about the authority of Jesus. Jesus reminding the disciples, you have received without paying. You've received. The authority that the disciples have is an authority that is derived from Jesus. So when we think about proclaiming the gospel as an authority-enriched task, let's start out with that. The authority to proclaim the gospel is an authority that is received from Jesus. But because that authority comes from Jesus, that authority, it can't be used however we see fit. It makes sense now to say that the authority serves the purposes of Jesus. These are the two things I want to say about authority. That authority derives from Jesus, and because it derives from Jesus, it serves the purposes of Jesus. You see, proclaiming the gospel is an authority-enriched task. Look, if you will, at verse 1, the statement, all the promises about the miraculous things that will happen by the authority of Jesus. Unclean spirits, you'll be able to cast them out. Disease, you'll be able to heal. Affliction, you'll be able to heal. The sick will be healed in verse 8, raised from the dead, cleanse lepers, demons will be cast out. These miracles, though, they don't exist for the disciples' purposes. You see, authority is derived from Jesus to satisfy the purposes of Jesus. The task that Jesus is going to give to the disciples, it's not a medical mission. It's not a mission of spiritual warfare in the worst possible sense. It's a mission that serves the purposes of Jesus because he's the author of the authority of the mission. I want us to think about the fact that Jesus is utilizing his authority in a way that has cosmic value. If you had authority, what would you do with the authority? What does Jesus do with his authority? He gives it to his disciples, that his disciples might serve a purpose that's larger than themselves. You know what the purpose of this mission of Jesus is all about? Here's the purpose. The purpose is related to fulfilling all of the promises of the Old Testament. You see, if I show up and I exercise my own authority, then that has something to say about the scope of my mission. But if the authority comes from Jesus, the scope of the mission, wow, that's enormous. That Jesus exercises his authority through the disciples that he might keep all of the promises of the Old Testament. You should know this. In Matthew chapter 10, it's actually the first time we run into the word 12. You see how many times the word 12 shows up in our passage? They are called 12 in verse 1. He called to him his 12. And then you see in verse 2, the names of the 12 apostles, Matthew says, are these. And jump down to verse 5. These 12 Jesus sent out. Why 12? Any Jew would understand that 12 has massive significance. What Jesus is doing is he's fulfilling a purpose that's far larger than the imagination of the disciples. Jesus is actually solving all of those promises that were made in the Old Testament. Jesus, if we are to listen to him rightly, we need to understand that Jesus is reconstituting the entire Old Testament. You know, the word 12, it shows up all over the place in the Old Testament. It would be impossible for a Jew to hear the word 12 without thinking about perhaps the 12 tribes of Israel, without thinking about the 12 pillars that were constructed at the giving of the law. It would be hard for them not to think about the 12 gemstones that would be on the ephod, the breastplate of the priest. It would be hard for them to not think about the 12 stones from the river Jordan at the conquest, the 12 territorial inheritance of the conquest. The 12 metal oxen that would hold the big basin that would be in Solomon's temple. There are 12s all over the Old Testament, and those 12s of the Old Testament, they lead us right into the New Jerusalem, the new heavens and the new earth, because we find 12 all over the book of Revelation. The 12 gates with the names of the 12 tribes. A wall that has 12 foundations with the names of the 12 apostles. A tree of life with 12 kinds of fruit. You see, if this authority is derived from someone like Jesus, you can count on the purpose of that authority to be far larger than our own. You might be able to say it like this. You remember as a kid playing with a magnifying glass, holding it up in the sun, and getting the focal point to be just a hot red dot on the sidewalk. And Jesus seems to be doing that with the entire Old Testament. But he's saying that the whole Old Testament is about me. It's all about Jesus. Do you wonder why verse 5 shows up? Verse 5 says, "Go nowhere among the Gentiles or Samaritans. Go to the lost sheep of Israel." They're lost. The promises are awaiting fulfillment. And Jesus says to the 12, he says, go to them that they might understand that the focal point of the Old Testament is me. Your authority comes from me, and you are serving my purposes. In Jeremiah chapter 50 says that the people of Israel, they are without a shepherd, and they're lost. And Jesus is, through the work of the disciples, Jesus is saying to the people, I am that shepherd. Now, as we understand more about this task, we know that not all of the hearers of the gospel will greet that news happily, but it is still what the disciples are called to do. Authority derives from Jesus to serve the purposes of Jesus. But we're talking about this proclamation of the gospel that is an authority-enriched task. What about that task part? What is happening? Well, Jesus, he's removing the walls so that you can see the studs. And the studs are the best expression of the authority of Jesus. The studs are the gospel. This is what you're about. You're to go out and to proclaim a ministry as you go. Do you see that in verse 7? That's the hot focal point of the ministry of the disciples. You're to proclaim as you go. It is interesting to see, I think, in verse 7, how the proclamation of the gospel happens before the healing ministry. See 1 and 7, 1 and 8. That as you go, you're proclaiming the gospel. And you're doing so with an authority that is derived from Jesus for the purposes of Jesus. Well, what can be said about the task itself? Just like the authority, so the task. Just as authority is derived from Jesus for the purposes of Jesus, so is the task. The task is derived from Jesus for the purposes of Jesus. You see in verse 7 that they are called to proclaim that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Jesus himself has proclaimed that. John the Baptist has proclaimed that. And disciples are invited to participate in this task of Jesus. We derive it from Jesus, but we're echoing the very words of Jesus. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. And would you note that verse 7, that word for proclamation, that's not the word for proclaiming the good news. It's a word of a herald shouting something that must be heard. Those who were culturally conscious, the original audience of Jesus, they surely would know that that word for proclaim is an attack word. It's a war word. When you're attacking a city, you would surround that city with all of your weaponry. The city would look from behind her walls and know that she is about to be conquered. But the conquering wouldn't immediately begin. The general would send a herald, and the herald would go to the gates of that city and offer one last opportunity to surrender. And the herald would proclaim not with their authority, but with the authority of the general. And the herald would say, "Accept the terms, or you will be defeated." It would have been impossible for the disciples to not hear that in verse 7 in that word proclaim. And we think about what the task it is that they're called to perform. The task is to shout with an authoritarian assertion, not with your authority, but with the authority of the king. And the assertion is this: you must respond to this message. You must respond to this message. I've received it by the authority of another. I'm speaking as his mouthpiece. You must respond. You see, the task, it's derived from Jesus. But the task also serves the purposes of Jesus. The followers of Jesus are to proclaim a gospel that can do things that they cannot do. When we hold out the gospel makes promises we can't deliver. Do you feel that when you tell others about Jesus? Mid-sentence, you can offer a promise that if you believe in him, your sins will be forgiven. Mid-sentence, you can feel that it seems almost impossible. And perhaps the person I'm talking to finds it impossible. That actually should be a comforting feeling to a Christian. It's a reminder that the proclamation of the gospel is a promise that we can't make happen. But Jesus can. Because the authority of Jesus has a Jesus-filled authority, and the task of Jesus has a Jesus-filled task. It will be done, but by the work of someone else. This is what the disciples are learning as Jesus removes the sheetrock. He's learning that they're called to proclaim a gospel that is in authority enriched. That's what they're to do. If that's the authority enriched task, what's the cost? Most of this passage, as Jesus opens Matthew chapter 10, is devoted to describing the cost. Isn't it wonderful having a Lord and Savior who's honest with us? We may not like to hear this, but Jesus refuses to lie. And so the second point of the sermon is about the cost. Followers of Jesus proclaim the gospel at a cost to themselves. It's so hard to look at these three costs and not imagine that it might be possible to tell someone about Jesus without experiencing all three of these costs. Or maybe to experience the cost in very small degree. And we just don't always know how the cost will come to us. But Jesus is telling his disciples just before they go to complete the task that there are three things that will be a cost to you. And the first is in verses 9 through 10, the cost of urgency. And then at verse 11, there's a shift. 11 through 13, the cost of vulnerability. And then at the very end, 14 through 15, the cost of rejection. Jesus wants his disciples to know this. Verses 9 through 10, the cost of urgency. In the opening words of verse 9 in the Greek, it's clear that the word acquire is to receive emphasis. Acquire no gold or silver or copper. You're not on a mission to gain funds. You're on a mission to perform the task of Jesus. It's interesting that verse 9 has sometimes in the history of the church been understood as a call to asceticism, to separate yourself from the world and from all material things. This would be an argument for someone who perhaps feels as though sharing the gospel as a monk is the best way to do it. Verse 9 is not an argument for asceticism. It's an argument for urgency. Jesus is taking their preparation and he's setting it aside. He's taking their risk management and he's setting that aside as well. He's saying these things, preparation and risk management, they certainly have a use, but they are not ultimate. Remember, the task derives from Jesus for the purposes of Jesus. The Gospels actually measure our lives differently than we do. It would be helpful to read this passage, as many commentators do, verses 9 through 10, as an argument not for proclaiming the gospel with nakedness, but for complaining the gospel with simplicity. You're in a hurry. We're not all about the preparation and the comfort of gospel proclamation. Go now, quickly. Hasn't Jesus just said in verse 38 of chapter 9 that the call is urgent? The fields are ready. Acquire no gold or silver or copper, because urgency is at stake. Some of you who know me know that I struggle with overthinking, hyper-analysis. Maybe it's a Presbyterian thing, I don't know. But Jesus is saying, go, do. Preparation and risk management are not the most important thing for you now. You are to go and to proclaim. You see, in verse 11, he switches. Here he is talking about where they might stay. He says in verse 11, find out who is worthy in it, in the village, and stay there until you depart. The cost here is vulnerability. You're actually vulnerable to the receptivity of the host. In Judaism, to be hospitable was very important. But that doesn't mean everyone did it. And Jesus is saying to his disciples, don't plan out your itinerary. You're going to have to be vulnerable. And if someone is there to receive you with hospitality, be received. It's hard to tell to what percentage of the time that might happen. And Jesus, he doesn't say. He doesn't say that 50% of the time you'll find a place to sleep indoors in that village. Would they do it if it was 50% of the time? Or would they wait for 80% of the time? Because if they're not received, they're sleeping rough. They're outdoors. They may have supper, but they may not. It's interesting that Jesus is actually making the disciples depend upon habits of Judaism that had long ago gone by the wayside. But if someone is hospitable, there you can stay. I'll say more about this in the conclusion, but isn't it the case that we don't want to be vulnerable? Don't all of us feel as though we must be seen by others as not being vulnerable, but having our lives together? Sunday morning can be a very highlight of that. Can I just say to you that Sunday morning, just come as you are. Just come as you are. We can spend so much time making sure that life is together. We don't want to be vulnerable. And I can say this to you. The disciples perhaps had not received much hospitality, but you, be hospitable, even if your house is a mess. It's just that we spend so much time trying to get our act together. And Jesus does not give the disciples that opportunity. Go into the village and knock on doors, and if someone will have you, let them have you. The cost of vulnerability. And finally, the cost of rejection. The first sermon in Matthew's gospel, at the very end of that sermon, Jesus assured his followers that they would be persecuted. And in verse 14, he's making that clear. If someone says no to the gospel as we're sharing the gospel with them, isn't it nice just to be able to walk away? I have people in my family for whom I've shared the gospel many times, and they don't hear, and they don't hear, and they don't hear. But can I say this? When they say no to the gospel, I'm never kicked out of a house. When a stranger says no to the gospel, I don't have to then sleep outdoors or wonder where my next meal will come from. Rejection in this schema is an enormous cost to the disciples. For these disciples, if they're rejected from a home, it means re-entering the marketplace, searching yet again for hospitality, someone to take you in. It's very interesting that when we think about being rejected because of gospel proclamation, we want to be able to call down judgment. Isn't that what two of Jesus' disciples wanted to do? Call down judgment. But you see, at the very end of our passage, the judgment that's here, it's not the judgment that the disciples have control over at all. Remember, the task, it's derived from Jesus to serve His purposes. So even if the disciples are rejected, all they can do is shake the dust from their feet. They do not get to call down judgment. That lives with Jesus alone. And in fact, to shake the dust off their feet is really nothing more than saying they are Gentiles. And a Jew might be very offended by that. Someone shaking the dust off of their feet, saying to me that I'm not a Jew, I'm a Gentile. Can I just remind you that the ministry of Israel is a ministry to the world? That Jesus is a Jew and the disciples are a Jew, and the promises that God made were promises that were made to Jewish people, but the promise was that through Jesus they would be a blessing to the world. The gospel can't be stopped by the rejection of a Jew. The gospel can't even be stopped by the rejection of a Gentile. These people should be saying yes to the gospel and proving to be a blessing to the Gentiles. But even if they don't, that gospel will still go out into the world. Why? Because the gospel's authority is not the authority of a disciple, it's the authority of Jesus for His purposes. I'm going to tie some of this together. We're talking about the proclamation, and we're talking about the cost. Followers of Jesus proclaim the gospel at a cost to themselves. The proclamation of the gospel is authority enriched, and the proclamation of the gospel will certainly come at a cost. But I want you to understand, Christian, that this is what's behind the walls. These are the studs. This is true for anyone who wants to be a follower of Jesus. These are the studs. And I want to conclude by reminding us that we are a special kind of Christian. We are a heavily ornamented kind of Christian. The American church is a church filled with ornamentation. There's a sense in which this message is especially painful to us as Americans. We tend to make many decisions based upon gaining or beautifying our home, nurturing our careers, aspiring with our education. We actually spend a lot of time talking about retirement plans. Not every Christian in the world does that, but we tend to. These are ornaments to our life, and they're good and even valuable. But Jesus, he's taking everything down to the studs. And there's a sense in which we ought to take a measure of offense at this, because Jesus is saying to us, a heavily ornamented people, that really what your life is all about is receiving my authority for my purposes, that you would perform my task for my purposes. Sometimes simplicity is helpful, beautiful, but simplicity like this, we're going to find over the next couple of sermons, is painful. There is a cost, and many of us feel this cost more and more. We didn't used to know people who were marginalized in their workplace because people found out that they're followers of Jesus, but now many of us know people like that. Some of you are experiencing that. But Jesus in Matthew 10 is saying he knew that. He knew that. And this is where we remind ourselves that if the proclamation of the gospel is my work, I should be desperate. But if the proclamation of the gospel is Jesus' work, there's no room for desperation. This is the message of salvation. Repent and believe, and you will have life abundantly and eternally. Not by our authority, but by his. Would you join me in prayer?